Hello, everyone. I want to warmly welcome all of you to this session entitled The Power of Bilingual Education for a Sustainable Future. My name is Luciana Fernandez, and I am a National Geographic Learning Senior Academic Consultant. And I'm very pleased to be with you, and I'm very happy to be talking about such an important topic. The first thing that I would like to do is to introduce you to the aims for today's session. Today, we're going to discuss the imperative need for an education for sustainable development. We will be exploring what education for sustainable development is. We're going to be discussing how bilingual education can empower students to become the agents of change the world needs. And we're also going to be exploring what bilingual education for sustainable development looks like in the classroom. So let us begin with discussing the imperative need for an education for sustainable development. I would like all of you to take a minute to think about the world that our students are inheriting. Our students live in a world with poverty. There's an imperative need to reduce poverty. But they also live in a world with hunger. A world that needs creative solutions to solve this problem. So many people with no access to food and to good nutrition. They also live in a world with too many people with limited access or no access at all to health services. They also live in a world where not everybody has access to high quality education, although education is a right for everyone. They live in a world with gender inequality. Our students are inheriting a world where a lot of people have limited access or no access whatsoever to clean water. They live in a world where climate change is causing irreversible damage to species and, of course, to the whole planet. They live in a world where life below water is in danger, and also life on land. They live in a world that needs affordable and clean energy for everyone. They live in a world where we need peace and justice for all as well. In a nutshell, they live in a world that needs innovation to come up with solutions to all these problems that we have discussed. Our students need to be agents of change. They need to come up with creative solutions and ideas for a sustainable future. They live in a planet that is screaming SOS. And so I would like to be quoting now Peter Senge saying, unless we change our way of living, the prospect ahead is not very encouraging. There must be a spiritual revolution as the only possible way we can imagine all of these issues actually changing. We need either to change what we are doing or do it with the kind of passion and conviction that we can bring to it. Without this, no new policies will be developed and no drastic change will occur. So if you think about this, educators have a very critical role. If we see our students as the agents of change, if we see our students as the ones who will come up with the possible solutions for all these problems, which are global in nature, then this means that the education we provide our students with needs to change. And so now we are moving on to discussing what education for sustainable development is. Education for sustainable development. According to UNESCO, this kind of education is based on all levels and types of learning. It's all about knowing and being and living together, doing and transforming oneself and society. It is the total sum of diverse ways to arrive at a learning society. This means that people learn from and with one another, and so collectively, people become more capable of withstanding all the setbacks and dealing with sustainability induced insecurity, complexity, and risks. So just figure how we are talking about educating our students to work collaboratively to solve these problems, which, as we said before, are global in nature. Education for sustainable development empowers people to change the way they think and work towards a more sustainable future. So, education for sustainable development aims at helping our students develop the knowledge, the skills, the values, and the behaviors needed for sustainable development. This type of education is about including sustainable development issues into teaching and learning, of course, so that students are encouraged to be and become responsible actors who will resolve challenges, respect cultural diversity, and contribute to creating a more sustainable world. So let us look at what education for sustainable development is all about. This kind of education is based on the principles and values that underlie sustainable development. It deals with the well-being of all four dimensions of sustainability: environment, society, culture, and economy. It uses a variety of pedagogical techniques that promote participatory learning and higher order thinking skills. It promotes lifelong learning. It is locally relevant and culturally appropriate. It is based on local needs, perceptions, and conditions, but acknowledges that fulfilling local needs often has international effects and consequences. So education for sustainable development is based on the principles and values that underlie sustainable development. This means that we are educating a student who is aware of the wider world and has a sense of their own role as world citizens. We are educating a student who respects and values diversity. We are also educating a student who has an understanding of how the world works. A student who participates in the community at a range of levels, from the local level to the global level. We are educating a student who is willing to act to make the world a more equitable and sustainable place. Something else we mentioned about education for sustainable development is that it deals with the well-being of all four dimensions of sustainability. Which are these four dimensions? Social, economic, cultural, and environment. This means that we are bringing into the classroom topics related to the social domain, such as peace, equity, and democracy. We are also bringing into the classroom issues related to the economic domain, such as work, money, education. But we are also inviting into the classroom topics related to the cultural domain, such as traditions and folklore and religion. And last but not least, we are bringing into the classroom topics related to the environment domain, such as conservation, preservation, and protection. I take for granted that you have heard about the Sustainable Development Goals, which happen to be the ones that you've got on the screen right now. No poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, affordable and clean energy, decent work and economic growth, industry, innovation and infrastructure, reduced inequalities, sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption and production, climate action, life below water protection, life on land protection, peace, justice, and strong institutions. And actually, Goal 17, which talks about partnerships for these goals. Because all these goals are global. And so our students, as future agents of change, will have to work collaboratively, something that we stated also before. And so how is it that we can start working towards this education for sustainable development? Well, simply bringing all these issues into the classroom and making our students become active participants in the solution of these problems from a very early age. And so we can bring into the classroom the topic of water. And we can problematize it from the very beginning, from the title of a unit, if I may say, such as water for everyone. Is there water for everyone? Yes, no. A student might start reflecting upon this from his or her local reality and then open up to this more globally. Now, one of the things we mentioned before about education for sustainable development is that it uses a variety of pedagogical techniques that will engage the learner and will make the learner be very active, and of course will engage the learner in higher order thinking. So if we start looking at how we work on education for sustainable development, we are not only talking about bringing all these topics into the classroom, but we are talking about problematizing these topics. We are talking about bringing these topics through big questions, such as, for example, if we were dealing with the topic of water, we could be asking our students, where does water come from? Or why is water so important? So big questions or essential questions, these questions which do not have only one answer. And most importantly, a characteristic of these big questions is that they will make our students wonder and even answer, I don't know, and I need to know. The other way in which we invite critical thinking about these topics is by engaging our students in investigation, in searching for answers to these big questions, and engaging our students in critical reading and writing opportunities. Now, a characteristic of education for sustainable development is that it engages students in critical thinking. And the thinking that happens in our students' minds needs to be made visible. That's why visible thinking and the use of visible thinking routines and our students having the possibility to engage in metacognition, so that the ideas and the way in which they come up with their thoughts is made visible to themselves and others is really critical. Now, our students need to be engaged in thinking routines. High quality thinking needs to become a habit. So it's really very important that you also understand that part of education for sustainable development has to do with explicitly teaching and providing students with the opportunity to create habits of mind that good thinkers have. For example, using thinking maps so that students can show how the ideas connect. And students are going to be asked thought-provoking questions. They will engage in an investigation phase in search for these questions. They will think critically about information provided in different sources, and eventually they will reach conclusions. Their thinking will probably change. New learning will occur, and now this new learning is going to be shared with others through a presentation, for example. Now, quoting Peter Senge again, when people have a chance to slow down and think about something, in this particular case, think about these global issues that we started our session with today, they become aware of these issues and they are deeply concerned about the way we live. It's really very important that we make our students slow down, look at these problems, and think critically about these problems. And we need to involve our students so that from a very early age, they feel that they are possible agents of change. So how do I connect where I live, where I am, and what I do to a larger whole? A very important thing to consider is that all these topics that we have been mentioning, I like using the word glocal, which is a concoction, a combination of the words global and local. The idea is that we give our students the possibility to relate personally to these topics from their local reality, but we will also give them the opportunity to explore these issues from a global perspective. Something is out there interacting with something inside us, leading to an experience that Humberto Maturana describes beautifully as bringing forth a reality. So this is basically about providing our students the opportunity to relate to all these issues. What's inside me? What do I bring to this learning experience? What do I know? What experience do I have? And what is it that I need to discover through investigation and new learning? So basically, education for sustainable development needs to, or seeks to, move students from being apathetic to being curious, from being passive to being proactive, from being extrinsically motivated by grades, for example, to being intrinsically motivated by this drive to help, to become active agents of change, from being dependent to being independent-minded, from being dogmatic to being open-minded, from being timid to being adventurous, from being fragile to being robust and resilient, and from being credulous to being skeptical, wondering, asking, always questioning. And for example, it's really very important to understand that we are educating students that are part of the information era, and they have access to information 24/7. And so they need to question. They need to question more. They need to be skeptical, as we said before. And we need, as educators, to provide them with the critical thinking skills needed to cope with such an array of information. And so I was mentioning a second ago this question of using the word local. So all the issues that we are bringing into the classroom need to be locally relevant and culturally appropriate. So all the issues brought into the classroom by Education for Sustainable Development are based on local needs, perceptions, and conditions, but acknowledge that fulfilling local needs will have international effects and consequences. So basically, it's our students understanding that they might be doing something very small from their local perspective, which will have an impact globally. And it has to do with moving from the local to the global and the global to the local. And let me just exemplify how you can simply do this in the classroom. For example, as I was saying before, by already working on units that have a title that invites to think, such as, for example, talking about trash. And we are problematizing this through a big question, like, why should we care about garbage? And then working from what students already bring to the learning experience, such as share what you know already. Think about an empty jelly jar and list 5 ideas for reusing the empty jar. So we are already from the very beginning asking a question and building some background knowledge with a concept such as recycling, which is so linked. And of course, using powerful photography, which is an excellent way in which we can bring the world and all these issues into the classroom. As I was saying before, if we want to deal, for example, with a topic such as water, which happens to be one of the sustainable development goals we discussed before, the title is already an invitation for discussion, water for everyone. But we are also problematizing this through a big question. Where do we get water? Why is water so important? Where does water come from? And once again, we tap on what students already bring into the learning experience. Think of ways that people use water. What do you use water daily for? All right, so we are starting from our students' local reality, and then we are going to be opening up to a more global investigation of this topic. Now, something that I described before is a characteristic of Education for Sustainable Development, is the fact that the topics are so deep that students need to investigate and they need to interact with different sources of information for which they need to be critical thinkers. So one of the characteristics of Education for Sustainable Development is this infusion of critical thinking skills being explicitly taught to empower students to think in a deep way about the topic being explored. So we are, I know that critical thinking is a buzzword, but it's all about understanding that critical skills, there are very many, such as comparing and contrasting or classifying details. So it's not a matter of telling students you need to think critically. We need to teach them how. We need to tell them what sub-skills are embedded in this term known as critical thinking. And we need to name these sub-skills, and we need to teach them and model how to, for example, compare and contrast or classify details. And most importantly, we need to provide students with tools that will make this thinking concrete. For example, using a Venn diagram to compare and contrast, or a classification chart. This is what we meant before by using thinking maps to make thinking visible. Thinking maps are consistent visual patterns linked directly to specific thought processes. By visualizing our thinking, we create concrete images of abstract thoughts. So this is a quote from Project Zero from Harvard University, and it's really very important that we teach our students to become better thinkers, and that we empower them, for example, with thinking maps, which will make their thinking, which is so abstract, more visible and concrete. So thinking maps are going to help our students link ideas. So sometimes information comes to you in a chaotic way. So a thinking map is going to help our students organize and classify the information. Now, examples of visible thinking into the classroom are, for example, if you're going to be bringing issues through powerful photography, a fantastic routine is called I See, I Think, I Wonder. So it's not just a matter of asking students, what can you see, or describe the photo. It's about also engaging students in telling us what they think about what they are looking at. What connections are they making? What has the photo or image triggered? A prior experience, a prior knowledge, or why not a question? So what do you wonder also about what you are looking at? Another very famous visible thinking routine is the KWL chart. Before exploring any topic, what is it that you already know about that topic? What is it that you would like to know? And then at the very end of the investigation phase, what have you learned? There are very many of these routines, and they are these routines exactly are the ones that create the habits of mind of a designer, of an engineer, of somebody who wants to come up with an idea. So it's very important that we build on these learning skills in the classroom. So if you're bringing, for example, a powerful question, gives students individually the opportunity to think about that question, and then get together with somebody else and exchange ideas, and then share with the rest of the class. And most importantly, I think always begin the exploration of any topic by activating what students already bring to the learning experience. And after they have interacted with sources of information, and once new learning has happened, tell them, what do you know now that you didn't know before? What do you think now that you did not think before? This is becoming aware of learning. And so bringing topics that are related to a change in the world, such as happy to help, and problematizing this with the question, how do people help each other? And it's really very important that when you start by problematizing the topic, you get students to record what is happening to them with this question. And so they can use thinking maps to leave a record of those initial thoughts. And then it's really very important, after students have investigated or interacted with sources of information, that they go back to the question and that they are confronted with those initial thoughts, probably realizing that their thinking, what they're learning has changed. Or a time to act. Why do people take a stand? And once students have reached conclusions or ideas, once that new learning has taken place, how important it is that they have the opportunity to share this new learning with others. So that's why we were mentioning that a characteristic of education for sustainable development is that students become active learners, active investigators, that they are equipped with the thinking skills to interact critically with the sources of information, and that all the conclusions that they have reached, all the new learning that has taken place, can be passed on to others. Because this is going to make our students very effective communicators. And so how important it is that we give students the opportunity to share their new learning, and that they can actually choose how they would like to do it. If they would like to write a biography, or if they would like to conduct a debate, or if they would like to create a photo slideshow or writing a letter. So giving students different possibilities through which they can share what they have learned. So, for example, going back to the question, where does water come from? How would you like to share your ideas? And so now we are moving forward to another question. What about bilingual education? Because so far we have talked about education for sustainable development. We have looked at the global problems that our students are inheriting and how important it is to see our students as the agents of change who are going to be changing this reality. But what about bilingual education? And so I would like to quote now a colleague from Brazil, Isabela Vilas-Boas, talking about this question of becoming aware of the different ways in which we can work on bilingual education. So we've got the term EFL, we've got immersion, we've got content-based language teaching, and we've got CLIL, which has also become a buzzword, like content and language integrated learning. And in this very useful chart, we've got 4 questions to understand the differences. Who teaches, where the focus is on, where the feedback goes, and which are the assumptions. So I want you to know, dear colleagues, that when we use the term bilingual, it applies to EFL, immersion, content-based language learning, and also CLIL. But there are some differences that we need to become aware of. So in the case of EFL, who teaches? The language teacher. The focus is on language, the feedback is on language, and the assumptions are that language is learned by studying it. It's not that there is no content here. We might be bringing, and we should be bringing also content, but the content in this type of bilingual education, if I may say so, is to contextualize the language to be learned by the student. In the case of immersion, who teaches? The subject teacher. Let it be geography, history, literature. The focus is on the subject, and so is the feedback. And the assumption in immersion is that content is learned without specific attention to language. So we are providing students with materials in the target language, but the focus is on the subject. So as you can see, clear differences between EFL and immersion. If we move on to content-based language learning, who teaches? The language teacher. But the focus and the feedback are both on content and language. This means that the language teacher brings the content, teaches content, and also teaches language. The assumption here in content-based language learning is that language is learned by studying content. The idea is that content drives the language, and language is related to the content that is being studied. In the case of CLIL, who teaches? A subject teacher or expert language teacher, or the teachers working collaboratively. The focus on the feedback are both on the subject and the language, and the assumption is that language depends on content and vice versa. Let me tell you, dear colleagues, that more and more we are moving on to content-based language teaching and CLIL, where the focus is both on content and language. It's almost impossible to separate language from content. So looking into the new bilingual education for this type of student in mind, it's very important that we stop to think about what is it that students need to succeed in college careers, future careers, and in life. And so we are thinking about a profile of student, a student who is informed about and ready to respond to local, national, and global issues, a student who is knowledgeable in core academic subjects as well as more complex areas such as the environment, finance, the economy, health, and business. A student who is able to participate safely, intelligently, productively, and responsibly in the digital world. And so now we're moving on to a big name when it comes to bilingual education, Ofelia Garcia, saying very powerful things, such as the fact that bilingual education is a right and a necessity for all students in the world, saying that bilingual education is the only way to educate students in the 21st century, saying that bilingual education cannot any longer be just a privilege of the elite, and that we are in need to be reminded of the limited, short-sighted traditional view of bilingualism from the monolingual, monoglossic perspective. And if you think about all this, dear everyone, Ofelia Garcia is saying all students need access to bilingual education. And we are now talking about bilingual education for sustainable development. Garcia's thesis is that bilingual education is the only way in which we can educate our students who live in a world which is a global world. They live in a global and technologically advanced era. Ofelia Garcia is talking about classrooms where students use 2 or more languages in complex combinations. And of course, she's also talking about reimagining bilingualism as dynamic and discursive. And so, going back to the profile of these students as agents of change, this is the kind of education that seeks to educate inquirers, communicators, thinkers, students who are knowledgeable, principled, balanced, students who are risk takers, who are reflective, caring, and open-minded. And so, what does bilingual education for sustainable development look like in the classroom? So if we understand, as Ofelia Garcia says, that this is the only way in which students living in such a world can be educated, then what does it look like? So bilingual education for sustainable development into the classroom looks like follows. Students often work in teams. They tackle projects that deal with real, local, and global problems. For example, in the domains of health, environment, business, and more. Teachers bring these topics into the classroom through tough questions, those questions which are triggers and thought-provoking. But they might not provide all the answers. So remember that the main role of these tough questions, the main role of problematizing these topics is that, of course, these questions will activate whatever prior knowledge students have. But the idea is that our students are puzzled by the question, that they are curious, that they realize that they might say something and another partner in the class might say something completely different. And so there is a doubt, there is a question, there is something that I really want to know. Remember that one of the characteristics is that we want students to be curious. In bilingual education for sustainable development, students are provided with meaningful opportunities to apply their knowledge, prove what they know by presenting it to others, as we mentioned before. Let it be their classmates, other classes at school, or why not even beyond the school walls to the community. And so bilingualism, as stated by UNESCO, is a 21st century skill. And as Ofelia Garcia was saying, it's a right. And so bilingual education for sustainable development takes different shapes. You may have heard about task-based learning or project-based learning, inquiry-based learning, or CLIL, as we described before. So let us look at all of them and how they are related to this profile of student that we have detailed. In task-based learning, there is a pre-task in which students are introduced to the topic and they are given the opportunity to deal with a task. Let it be that the introduction to the topic is through a question that students need to discuss. Then there is the task cycle in which students are going to get to work with other partners to solve that task. They are going to be thinking about this task, planning and reporting. And then there's the language focus, in which we are analyzing the way in which the task was approached and why not something new is learned. Now, in inquiry-based learning, it's really very important to think about the inquiry learning cycle. And this is so at the heart of bilingual education for sustainable development. Remember that we've been talking about bringing these topics, which are global, remember that word? Topics that students are going to have the opportunity to relate personally to, but we'll also explore from a more global perspective. The way in which we are bringing these topics into the classroom is through questions. So we are making our students wonder. We are making our students notice. We are giving them the opportunity to ask further questions. We are stating a problem. Now that there is something that has ignited our students' curiosity, now that there is a question to ask or a problem to solve, now students are going to move on to this investigation phase I have been mentioning. And remember that investigating is not Googling, it's not cutting and pasting information, but it's all about students thinking critically and interacting critically with sources of information, for which they need these sub-skills such as dealing with data and organizing the data and describing and classifying and drawing. That is why before I was talking about how critical it is to empower our students with the explicit teaching and opportunities to practice all the sub-skills embedded in critical thinking. So students are going to be investigating and planning and reading and researching and doing field work and interviewing. Notice the array of skills embedded in as students search for answers to this question that is posed at the very beginning of the cycle. As students are interacting with the sources of information, they're going to be observing and examining and measuring and making interpretations. And of course, they are going to be thinking critically as they are logically thinking about the information and relating and discussing and analyzing and providing alternative explanations. For all this, the visible thinking routines we were referring to before are mandatory. And students might also be looking back into ideas and why not dealing with experiments and why not dealing with models. And now there's also a very important phase in the inquiry cycle, which has to do with students engaged in reflection and having the opportunity to revise and rethink and reach conclusions. And it's precisely these conclusions and new thoughts, which are the result of all this thinking that has taken place as they were investigating, that is going to be shared with others. And so when it comes to project-based learning has the inquiry cycle at its heart. Notice that it begins with a driving question which ignites students' curiosity in such a way that it creates and need to know. And now we are going to start the inquiry cycle as students are investigating, all right, and searching for further answers or possible solutions. That's why we are mentioning the word innovation. And as they are interacting and investigating, they are applying 21st century skills such as critical thinking, communication, creativity, and collaboration. An aspect of project-based learning, which is very important, is student voice and choice. Remember that we discussed this before today. As I was saying, give students the opportunity to decide how they want to share with others what they have learned. This is what choice is all about. And when it comes to voice, we are not searching for any parroting of information here. We want students to express themselves, what has happened to them with all the information that they have access to. What conclusions have they reached? Can they explain all their new learning using their own words? Can they provide examples? It's really very personal. And of course, there is a reflection phase in which there is constant feedback from the teacher to the students and among students. And finally, there is this presentation of the product. This means that in project-based learning, students create a final product which perfectly well synthesizes their new learning. And the idea is that it is presented to others, putting students' communication skills really to the test. And last but not least, CLIL, which, as we mentioned before, is content and language integrated learning. The idea in CLIL is that just like a characteristic of education, bilingual education for sustainable development, is this question of engaging students in higher order thinking skills, students working collaboratively, students speaking more than the teacher, with meaningful input, with simplified language, but not simple content. That is why Ofelia Garcia was also mentioning that the new bilingual education is this one which provides students with the possibility to use different languages. So students might be reading, for example, sources of information in their mother tongue, and then reporting what they have been reading using the target language that they are learning. There is this coming and going from one language to the other. In opposition to the kind of bilingual education of the past that would not allow students to use their mother tongue, and even the use of the mother tongue was something like a sin. Now, the new vision of bilingualism is understanding that part of that background learning that students bring into the classroom is their mother tongue, is their knowledge of the language that they speak as native speakers. Now, another characteristic of CLIL is detailed planning, and of course, how students will have the possibility to deal with authentic material. And so once I came up with this, and I thought it illustrated it very well, the concern of a language teacher, because the language teacher says, oh my goodness, so the new vision of bilingual education and this education for sustainable development is that we need to bring content which is related to the world, and we need to teach students explicitly thinking, so cognition is also part of the equation, and the teacher is wondering, where does language fit if I have to devote time to content and if I have to explicitly teach, for example, thinking skills. And the final conclusion as we are reaching the end of this session is that it's impossible to teach content separately from language, and it's impossible to teach cognition separately from language, because we need language to share our thoughts, our ideas, and our conclusions. And of course, we need language to be able to read, write, listen to, and speak about whatever content. So language is the vehicle. In bilingual education for sustainable development, language is not an end. It's a means to an end, but it's always there. Just think about the examples you've got on the screen right now. If I want to teach my students comparing and contrasting, making comparisons, which is a sub-skill within critical thinking, then I need to teach them the language for making comparisons and contrasts. So that is where language is. And if I want my students, for example, to describe, they need the language for description. And if I want my students to ask and answer questions, they need the language for that. So language is the vehicle. It's always there. So it's very important that you also see that in education for sustainable development, it's the functions of the language, what students are going to be doing with the language to summarize, the language to explain, the language to compare and contrast, the language to make comparisons, the language for asking and giving information. And so I would like to quote a National Geographic explorer, Guillermo de Anda, saying that teachers of English have one of the biggest missions in the world, connecting every student in every corner in the world with the rest of the people. So in education, in bilingual education for sustainable development, the role of the teacher is bringing the topics that are global through the language, and also the language that will help students be able to talk about these global issues with people from all over the world. And so, reaching a conclusion, education for sustainable development is about content. It's about choosing very carefully what content. We have been very clear about this in this session. The content that has to do with these issues in the world that our students are interested in, should be interested in as citizens of a globalized world. It's also about empowering students with the skills to be critical thinkers. It's giving them the tools. It's teaching the skills and providing students with the opportunity to put these skills to the test. And of course, it's also about the language for students to be able to address the content, talk about the content, read the content, listen to the content, and talk about it. So it's if you pay attention, we've got these three very important pillars of bilingual education for sustainable development: content, language, and cognition. And so, dear everyone, we've made it to the end of this session. I would really like to thank, in the first place, National Geographic Learning for making it possible for me to be with all of you today, talking about the importance of rethinking bilingual education, considering the students we have in our classrooms today, and how important it is that you see the students sitting in your class as the future agents of change. Because if you see them as future agents of change, then there's nothing left but providing them with the education that they need for such an important mission that they have. So my name is Luciana Fernandez. On the screen, you've got my email address for us to remain in contact. Thank you so much.